Okay, let's get started. This is also going to be zero script. Um, Again, I just have so many video ideas that I think it's better for me to make more videos, have shitty PowerPoints in the background and zero script, but at least hopefully we get to cover a lot of ground. This one I mentioned in the previous video that the petrodollar system is a system that we live under right now, and if there's one system that we should understand in order to gauge what's going on around us, then it's obviously the system we live under. I said that this chart I'll end up showing it quite a lot because the amount of events and everything which can be explained looking at this graph is and what's behind this graph is quite extraordinary. But essentially here we have what's being used globally as reserves for global institutions and countries, and we can see how historically it's pretty much always been gold. And then after World War II, we moved to this US dollar system, and now we're moving back towards the gold system. Well, let's jump in. And what is the history of this US dollar global system that we're going to be talking about today? So, as I mentioned, started at the end of World War II. Pretty much everyone was decimated after World War II. All of the main powers had their industries absolutely destroyed, their male populations destroyed as well. And the US, I put USD here, the US was the only main power with all of their industry intact. They could still make stuff, they could still help people rebuild. And they also had, I believe, around half of the world's gold at that point as well. They were also the main victor in both the Asian and the Pacific and European theater, and they were also the only nuke boys at the time, so they had a lot of power. They could call the shots, and they decided, okay, at Bretton Woods, they decided, look, we're all going to use the dollar to trade. You can keep dollars, and if ever you want to trade your dollars in, you'll be able to trade them for gold. I think it was like $33 per gram of gold, per ounce of gold. Yeah, per ounce of gold, sorry. And all of the other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. So that was the system. It sounds quite simple, but why is it impactful? Well, there's a lot of reasons why you want the global reserve currency. Throughout history, pretty much whoever was the reserve currency was the global power. It allows you to have a stronger currency because there's more demand for your currency. More people are buying your currency, so your currency is stronger than it usually would be. It means you could buy a lot more shit with. I'm trying to sweat a lot more stuff with your money. Like if you go to a poor country and you can buy like 20 steaks with £1 or $1, which you used to be able to. The reason is because our currency is a lot stronger than their currency. It's more in demand. So yeah, you want a strong currency. Well, sometimes you want a strong currency. It also enables the US to export inflation. Again, I'm going to go through these very quickly, but we'll create separate videos for some of these slides. But it allows the US to export inflation. So if 100 countries are using the dollar and the US prints a bunch more dollars, that inflation is balanced across 100 countries and not just the US. So it allows them to inflate their currency without feeling the effects at home. It allows them to borrow at cheaper rates, so they get lower interest rates. And there's more demand for people buying US debt, so yeah, lower interest rates. And it's also a very powerful economic weapon. I said times three, but essentially you can cut people off from the dollar, you can take their dollars. And if you look at this chart here, you can see all of the countries which have any kind of color to them except for green. They are all countries which have some kind of sanctions against them. So you can see how much sanctions are being used by the US. So it's a very powerful tool, and a lot of countries who are absolutely decimated, you can trace it back to some of this sneaky either sanctions or playing around with interest rates and all of this stuff that the US can do with the dollar. When you hear weaponizing dollar, these are some of the things I'm talking about. But anyway, global currency, very important, a lot of benefits. Why it always fails. So whenever anyone has a global currency, it has always and it will always fail. That's why I'm not going to go into the history actually of what else was proposed, but anyway, it always fails. The explanation is something called Triffin's dilemma or Triffin's paradox. Essentially, if you're the global currency, you have to perpetually be in a trade deficit because there need to be dollars out there in the system that people can use globally. So you need to essentially always be flooding the market with your currency. It means that your currency is strong and ever strengthening. And I mentioned earlier that that's a good thing in some ways. It's also a bad thing in others because it means that your exports are not competitive. So whenever Donald Trump is moaning about manufacturing going down and all of this stuff, it's inevitable if you're a global currency, and there's no solution to it. No tariff is going to help that. Also, it increases your debt, and that goes to the kind of perpetual trade deficit. So if it always fails, how comes it hasn't failed yet for the US dollar? Well, it actually did. The US has already effectively defaulted once before. I mentioned that the US dollar was pegged to gold. During the Vietnamese War, the US was running such an insane deficit to fund the war. They also needed to fund social programs at home to try and placate the masses who just were not behind the Vietnamese invasion. So they just, were printing crazy to try and fund everything. Then France, I think it was under de Gaulle, was like, wait a minute, where are you getting all of this money? We want our gold back. So they sent warships to France, to the US, which is very ballsy for France to do, to collect their gold. And then everyone started wanting to collect their gold. And that's when Nixon got on TV and he was like, you know what? We're going to temporarily unlink or delink the dollar from gold. And ever since, the dollar has obviously not been linked to gold. So that is an effective default on their debt. So if they've already defaulted and the system has already died, then how comes we're still in the US dollar system? Well, after that, that's when USD system 2.0 is born, and that's what we call the petrodollar, which is the system we're under now. And I'm sure you would have heard the term petrodollar before, but essentially everyone in the world needs energy, everyone needs petrol, the importance of which can't be understated. I should have got a graph actually here to show the correlation between development and energy consumption, but it's it's correlated to a very high degree. You can basically track how developed a country is by how much energy they're consuming. And this is not just for today. You could do that, across 2,000 years. You can go back, 2,000 years and figure out how rich someone in the Roman Empire is based on their energy consumption. So energy is king. Petrol or oil-based products were the main way of getting energy. So what the US and Saudi did was they secretly met and they agreed that Saudi would exclusively sell and price oil in the US dollar. And this meant that, they essentially had a new form of gold. They had, this black gold to peg the US dollar to. So there's now a new reason for people to want to buy and keep US dollars. So this is cool. We're done. Problem solved. But it's not solved. With the gold, it worked because the US owned that gold, whereas here, especially at this time, the US didn't own this petrol, right? This oil. So what we ended up having was US dollars pooling or collecting in either the oil exporting countries, because they'd be exporting their oil, getting a crud load of US dollars and then not needing to spend all of those US dollars. So they'd end up with huge pools of US dollars. And at that point, why would they want more US dollars? And in addition to that, countries who have really high trade surpluses, like Germany and Japan, and while they do need energy, they don't need that much energy. So again, you had USD pooling in some of these nations. So it works, but it creates a paradox. So how do we fix that paradox? Oh, there we go. Sorry. So the way to fix this was through military rent. So one of the first questions I had when I learned about all of this was, why would Saudi agree to sell all of their oil in US dollars? And the agreement was, you sell all of your stuff in USD, and we're going to protect you. And the second arm of this system is all of these countries, especially these countries who are, big oil exporters or are in a region where the US dollars are likely to pool. You'll see that the US have a lot of military bases there. So in the bottom right, you have a map and it shows you the number and the size of different bases across the world. The US has over 800 overseas bases, which is, by far the most. I think that China has like 30 something. So these military bases aren't there for free. It's essentially a protection racket. And not only is it quote unquote protecting them, but it's also ensuring that they continue to use and keep accumulating dollars. If they don't, then suddenly they're gonna see a bunch of Aloha snack bar guys causing all kinds of problems. So yeah, and you can see Middle East, around Japan, around Europe, South America as well, a high concentration of these bases. So that's one part of the military aspect. The second aspect as well is they managed to reclaim or get some of these US dollars to flow back, not only through the military rent with bases, but also through selling extremely overpriced military equipment. If you go online, you can see just how absurdly overpriced US gear is, and yet pretty much the whole world still buys it. You can compare it to the price of something from China, and even like parts to these military items, like for example some washers which would cost like a few dollars will be like $40,000. And the reason is because it's basically a monopoly. Like if they don't go to the US, where else are they going to go? Until recently. But more importantly, it's just a function to get US dollars flowing back into the US, and making sure that it's not pooling in these nations. It's a really good system. It's a lot better than the petrodollar system because it prevents the pooling of these dollars. But I said, it's very naughty. When people figure out what's going on, if they have a choice, they're not going to stand for it. And yeah, I mentioned starting fires in places. One thing which is quite interesting is like Donald Trump, for example, going around saying, I've fixed 7 wars. A lot of these wars, like for example, one in Rwanda, were wars which they have started. And then they have said to Congo, if you give us access to all of your minerals and this and that, then we'll protect you from these terrorists that we have armed and created. So a lot of these wars have been quote unquote solved, fires that they've started been put out. But it also shows the reason why they need these forever boogeymen, especially in places like the Middle East. Previously, it was Iran. Like Iran was the reason that all of these Gulf countries needed all of these bases and equipment. Now that we're seeing these Gulf countries start to mend ties with Iran, sorry, that's when we're seeing Israel coming forward and them being the boogeyman. America saying, well, let us protect you from this crazy dog, Israel, who's actually us in a dog costume. Anyway, a bit too long on this slide. So, So we have the demand for dollars is to buy petrol. The military is a way to make sure that these dollars circulate and they don't pool up in certain areas. Um, but when they do pool up in areas, instead of keeping your money in, hard currency, um, what can these countries like Saudi Arabia do with it? You don't want people to take these dollars and buy stuff in other currencies, otherwise that's going to weaken the dollar and basically not make you the reserve. You don't want them to come into the US and buy like loads of houses and infrastructure and that, because that's going to create issues as well. So a really smart way of handling this is through offering bonds and treasuries. So basically US debt. Um, you you buy my debt from me, and I'll pay you, like 5% a year each year. Then after 30 years, I give you your money back, something like that. It's a terrible deal. Like in terms of investments, you could very easily find better investments than this. Um, but again, a lot of the countries who agree to this either need to do so to keep their currencies weaker so they can continue exporting, or they need to do so, otherwise a bunch of Aloha snack bar guys are going to turn up inside their country and overthrow their government. So again, the military enforces this, but this is a way of trying to make it more reasonable for a country to hoard loads of dollars, right? Because at least they can say, well, we're investing in US debt and we're getting 5% back each year, even though it's barely above inflation. Um, it's also, I don't know if I have a slide about this next or not. Yeah, I do. Okay, cool. Um, what was I going to say? Borrow cheaper. Oh yeah, and then the main benefit for the US, as I mentioned at the start, is it allows the US to borrow cheaper, because everyone wants to buy their debt now because they don't want to just be sitting on hard dollars. So it means it's very easy for the US to sell their debt, and they can have a bigger and cheaper debt than everyone else. Yeah, talking about how bad of an investment it is, especially for developing countries, it basically massively delays the development of a country because let's say they work hard, they produce a load of stuff, sell it to the US, then that money goes into treasuries. It means that instead of having $100 to invest in their own country, they basically get $6 back, and each year they get $6 back. So it takes them years and years to actually get the return on what they're achieving. And it's, yeah, as you can see in the bottom, it's barely above inflation. Um, yeah, like why would people do that? Again, the only reason people would do that is if they don't, they're going to get couped, they're going to get terrorist, or they're going to get attacked financially as well. If you look at what happened in the Asian financial crisis, a lot of these countries weren't keeping loads of liquid bonds. Instead, they were developing their countries and their industries. Then they got um, economically attacked by the likes of George Soros, shorting their currencies, and the likes of Malaysia. I think they lost like 40% strength on their currency or something ridiculous, and had to get IMF loans and whatnot. But anyway, it's not a good deal, but you have to do it. Otherwise, it's going to be big doo doo. So the fourth arm of the leg, the fourth leg of the chair, sorry, is other rent-seeking activities. So the US has other ways to try and get the US dollars funneling back and circulating back to the US. One of them is techno-feudalism, which I forgot his full name, but the ex-Greek minister Yanis is a term that he came up with. But essentially, all of the digital architecture is owned by these big American tech companies. So if you want to market a product, or you want to put something online, or you want to sell something online, that money is essentially being like a portion of it is being sucked out of your country and being sent back to the US, circulating back to the US system. Like for example, if you think about like selling a car, in the old days, you'd go to a car lot, you'd buy the car off of them. The car lot would get, the 2K or whatever is their cut for having the parking lot there and the facilities to sell the car, etc. But now instead that cut is going to wherever you're buying it online, and then those, like eBay or whatever people use to sell cars, like all of these Amazons, etc. All of that money's instead of staying in the country and in the local communities, it's just being sucked off into the US and circulating money back. And that's the same with stuff like global payment systems as well on like a national level. Every time China and Russia previously did a trade, they'd be charged from the SWIFT system, and a portion of that money would go back to the US as well. And then debt doom loops as well. So the IMF and the World Bank, again, deliberately trapping countries in these debt doom loops, and that's going to increase the demand for dollar, but it's also going to help the dollars or prevent the dollars from pooling because we're destroying dollars from the system as well. So those are basically the four legs of the chair. You have the oil transactions to create the demand for dollars. Then you have the military racket, essentially, which is letting the dollars circulate back, but more importantly, making sure that everyone does their oil transactions in the US dollar, making sure everyone buys US debt. The third one is US debt, which I mentioned, makes it look like a good deal for the country, but kind of hinders the development of countries, whilst also giving the US the exorbitant privilege of cheaper debt. Then you have these rent-seeking activities as well, which are helping funnel US dollars back to the system, helping it circulate. Japan gets naughty. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good picture for this one. They were all censored. But if we look at when was it? I think it was the 80s, where Japan were really developing phenomenally. They had a huge trade surplus, and ungodly amounts of US dollars were pooling in Japan. Japan were going out, they were reinvesting in themselves, but more importantly as well, they were buying non-debt US assets. They were going and buying huge amounts of real estate and infrastructure in America, and creating all kinds of issues. So they even started issuing their own bonds as well. So the US meets with them and some of their other allies in 1985 in the Plaza Accord, and it says to them, look, we're going to weaken the US dollar, and then that's going to make our exports more viable, but also it's going to prevent some of that pooling of US dollars in the likes of Japan, because there's going to be less stuff being bought, and not everyone's going to get their car and this and that from Japan, so it's going to prevent some of that pooling in Japan. Creates a huge bubble for Japan. The bubble pops in 1992, collapses their economy. Their economy, some say, have like recently recovered from that, but I think if you look at it, their economy still hasn't recovered from the devastation that was caused by this. The US now wants a new Plaza Accord. You will hear Trump and multiple people from his cabinet saying that they want this Mar-a-Lago Accord. Essentially, they want to meet with people from, I imagine, the G7, but primarily with China, and they want to, again, have it so that China's currency is stronger. The exact same thing that they did with Japan, and China's not dumb, they study history intimately, so they don't want any part of that. The US are saying, we need to balance their economy, we need to turn them into a consumer economy. Essentially, what they want to do is make Chinese exports less competitive, exactly like they did with Japan, and that will lead to pretty much the exact same outcome. China's definitely not going to play ball. I think the US have realized that now, and that's why they've not been talking about Mar-a-Lago Accord. So instead now they're looking at tariffs. If you're not going to make yourselves uncompetitive, then we're going to stop these US dollars from pooling in your country by just stopping our people from buying as much stuff. You would have heard people like, I think it was Scott Bessent saying, instead of buying 30 doles, you're going to buy one dole, or something like that about the US consumer. But essentially, they realize that the US dollars aren't circulating back in time or quickly enough. So they're saying, while it hurts, our only approach now is to put tariffs on everyone and stop as many US dollars going out into the system. And hopefully that will help balance the system. It's going to, help prevent this pooling, help prevent this huge US debt, which again is inexorable because of Triffin's dilemma. Um, yeah, none of these are going to work. The US will eventually need to force the weakening of their currency. If I was a conspiracy theorist, I would say that all of this chaos and all of this deliberately bad policies are them trying to crash their dollars, because they know that it's the only way that they can um, manage their debt. And yeah, I wanted to put one piece to try and take everything we've learned and change our perspective on global geopolitics, because we have two players here. We have the EU and we have Saudi, and one of them's a beautiful democracy, stand for all about jargon, human rights, all about good stuff. And then on the right here we have Saudi, bunch of Muslims, done some very questionable things, um, very bad at piloting planes. So stop and ask yourself, who is the better US ally here? And I think that everyone would say, of course it's the EU. It's one of the US's best, closest allies. But let's have a look at this. Let's have a look at Saudi Arabia. Exclusively sells their oil in USD until recently, but let's ignore that. They have 5 military bases, and they spend over 7% of their GDP on defense. Over 7% of their GDP is going back out to the US. They're a global leader in US debt holdings, and there's a lot of people saying this, but I can't find any hard evidence. But a lot of people are saying that they are holding their US debt way below what the market value is. With some people have been saying that they're holding these bonds at like 1% or something ridiculous. So they have some kind of weird deal going on. And they're not in competition with the US in terms of any of the main monopolies. So if we look at all four legs of the petrodollar system, Saudi is playing ball. They're doing everything perfect. No complaints here, right? US loves them. Now let's have a look at the EU, and we'll start with the oil trade. Historically, mainly traded in dollars, but multiple occasions now they have tried to do their oil trade in euros. In the year 2000, they tried to trade with Saddam Hussein in euros. Then shortly after, Saudi bombed the Twin Towers, and so Saddam Hussein needed to be overthrown. If I was a conspiracy theorist, I would say that the US worked with Saudi to do that. Saudi did not want Saddam Hussein around at all, and obviously the US now won't want Saddam Hussein around if he's trading with people in euros. Anyway, so they tried to trade with Saddam in euros. Also with Gaddafi, there was plans to start trading with Gaddafi and I think everyone in Africa in a gold-backed dinar currency. There were talks about it in 2008, when the UK and US led NATO into overthrowing Gaddafi in 2011. And this isn't even a conspiracy theory, because the emails on Hillary Clinton's laptop, a lot of them were talking about how, okay, we need to create something in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi because of this. So I'm not even going to say if I was a conspiracy theorist, like this is why they got rid of this dude. They start trading with Russia outside of the US dollar for oil. I think they were using euros and then went to rubles. And this led to the quote unquote unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and then 2022. And then on top of all of this, they're working towards net zero and moving away from fossil fuels entirely. So if we're looking at the oil trade, which is the first leg of the petrodollar system, these guys are awful allies. Like they are just trying to cause issues here. EU military commitments. So if you remember, Saudi were spending, I think it's 7.1%. EU are part of NATO, but and in NATO they were meant to be spending 2% of GDP. They were spending well below that for their military. So again, less money is coming back from the EU, and we have dollars pooling in the EU, especially because they're not even buying, or they're trying not to buy their oil in dollars. So that's causing a huge issue. They also threatened to create their own military-industrial complex, and now we have a fix for these issues with a renewed Cold War. We now have Russia, who is a big boogeyman, and we have Iran as well. So now the EU is forced to have to increase their spending, and we have all of these leaders literally on the verge of bankruptcy, and they're saying we're going to increase our military spending so that we can fight Russia, which will never work, by the way. One quote that I like is so NATO, which is basically EU's military, how the EU plays with this military arm of the petrodollar system. When it was created, the first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, said it's the job of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And again, am I a conspiracy theorist? I got this quote off of the NATO website. So you can see that they just don't want for the Russians to have any kind of influence within the EU system. They want to crush the German industry as well, and both of these are going to prevent the pooling of these dollars. So very, very interesting. Oh, I hate to go back, but actually I want to go back to this slide. Again, this is the issue with doing it all in one take, because there's one really interesting thing to mention about the oil trade part of this equation. So I say here that the EU were trading with Russia and buying their oil outside of US dollars. When the war restarted, I should say, in 2022, one of the first things that the EU did was okay, we're no longer going to buy your gas and your oil products. Instead of buying them from Russia, they started buying them from India. Like Russia would sell all of these oil products to India, then India would process them, mark it up, and then sell it to EU at God knows how much the price. And that is very bizarre because they are still buying Russian oil products. In fact, they actually increased the amount they were buying. They were just buying it through India. And the US, until recently, didn't say anything about this. And then recently, the US wanted an excuse to put tariffs on India. So they say the reason why we're doing this is because you're reselling Russian oil. Well, then the Indian government put out a statement saying that when the 2022 war restarted, Joe Biden told us, hey, you guys need to buy the Russian oil, otherwise the global oil market would collapse. So why would the US not want Europe to be buying Russian oil from Russia in euros, but they would be totally fine with Europe buying it from India in dollars? Well, hopefully you know the answer to that. Anyway, first leg, second leg. So far, very naughty boys. These EU guys, very, very naughty. EU versus US bonds. In terms of holding US bonds, it's a mixed bag. Some of them, some of the countries, like I think Belgium, France, UK isn't in the EU, but let's say UK as well. Like we have some countries in there that hold a lot of US bonds. But the issue is as well, the euro was starting to um, be an international be a bond that people internationally were holding in addition to or instead of the US dollar. So they now are starting to compete with the US in terms of people buying their debt. And this is huge. And I think that when you hear Trump saying stuff like the EU was created to harm the US and the EU is destroying the US and all of this stuff, a lot of it is coming down. If you look at this chart and you look at the light blue, you can see that until recently, uh, until all of this Russia stuff started in 2014, the EU was gaining ground, and a lot of people were saying or thinking that, hey, we're going to see the US and the euro both be kind of global reserve currencies. We're going to have more than one. So, yeah, so naughty, so naughty. And then on rent-seeking activities, the EU again here threatening US big tech with taxes, lawsuits. They have their own neo-colonial activities, so doing a lot of the debt stuff and competing with the US there. And they threaten a lot of the US monopolies as well with their own versions. So again, like in all four areas, we have Saudi, who's like the golden boy, and we have Europe, who's the naughty boy, I'd say. So we have our winner, and I think that that when people hear some of the news about all these tariffs going on Europe or how you know America is stealing all of the jobs out of Germany and all of the industries and all of this stuff, and they act surprised. Why are people surprised? Like they sit at the table, they say the same stuff, and they smile at each other. But Europe and the US are not natural allies; they're competitors. And historically, like especially through the 80s, the 70s, the 80s, um, these European countries have always been cautious about the US and they've always had this hostility towards the US. One of the reasons that they didn't want to accept the UK into into the EU was because they said it's just going to be a backdoor for America to kind of hijack the EU. And unfortunately, as we've gone over, as we have seen over time, less and less European leaders are standing up to the US and speaking out against them. And my only explanation is that they've been captured and their interests are not with their people. Um, and now you only have, 3 or 4 countries, but you still have big parties within all of the major countries who are saying it how it is. Like the US is not our ally. The US is really tearing us apart. And I think that the US allowed the EU to run these shenanigans and to compete with them while times were good. But as times have gotten hard and as their system have started to deteriorate, there isn't enough food at the table for 2 people to eat, even if the US is eating 80% of the food. So now they are having to cannibalize their own quote unquote allies. Um, and I think that this leads into, um, you know, the EU's position and what the EU has done in all of these regards that we've mentioned. Pretty much guaranteed that the NATO-Russia war had to happen. Um, the first thing that I would say is the war was illegal. I think that's pretty obvious that it's an illegal a war from Russia's side, but it is not unprovoked. Um, Lavrov, who is the foreign minister of Russia, spoke to, I forgot who he spoke. I think it was a foreign, I'm not sure who it was, but it was someone very senior within the US administration in 2021, 2022. And he said, if you continue talking about Ukraine joining NATO, then we will invade Ukraine. Then this person went back, told Joe Biden, And then they returned to Lavrov and said, if that's what you're going to do, that's a risk we're willing to take. And so you can see here that they knew that the war was going to happen. They could have very easily stopped this. And since 1991, Russia has said that if Ukraine joins NATO, then there will be war. So what I'm trying to say is the US knew that this war would take place, and they continued to push. And the reason isn't because they wanted to screw over Russia. I think that that would have been an added benefit if they could somehow break Russia up a little bit, which I don't think honestly would happen. But more importantly, if they could isolate Russia, if they could get these, if they could get Russia to accept some of their terms, accept some of their, especially oil companies into Russia, isolate them in a global stage, like that would have been the icing on top. But the main person that, or the main group that they wanted to attack through this war is the EU. And the EU is by far the country who has done the worst since the war. Energy prices, and again we spoke about how energy is king. Energy prices in the EU and in the UK have just shot up astronomically. Their industry is now no longer viable. A lot of companies have moved over to the US, so it's been a little bit of a bolster to US manufacturing. And in addition to that, Europe has stagnated, fallen into unpayable debt. We're seeing France is about to default. Effectively, UK is, Germany is. Everyone's in really big trouble, and it's a lot of it comes back to this war with Russia. A couple of charts here which I think are interesting. You can have a look at, and I think that the one in the top left, the manufacturing in both the US and Euro was falling naturally. Their currencies are far too strong, but this the war with Russia has expedited the collapse of the EU manufacturing, and it's also slowed the collapse of the US manufacturing because a lot of these companies have gone over to Europe. So I think that 200 IQ play from US, very smart. I can't believe the EU would go ahead with this. Like, it's just very sad because everyone who agreed to this must have known what would happen and must have just, been captured in some way. Because historically, a lot of Europe was against trying to villainize Russia. But as I mentioned, as time's gone on, I think more and more people have been captured. And yeah, so I say 200 IQ, but if you look at the US now, they have a lot of issues. So what's gone wrong? I think the biggest mistake of our lifetime, and I think that if this didn't happen, we'd be living in a much different world. But when the war kicked off, the US kicked Russia out of the global financial system, they kicked them out of SWIFT, they sanctioned them, and they seized all of their Western assets. And since 2008, the petrodollar system was slowly dying. But once the US did this, it freaked the hell out of everyone. Like, the US has seized a lot of people's assets. They've kicked a lot of people out of SWIFT, but it's always been, kind of what we would look at as dodgy people like Venezuela and Libya and Iran. But now to do it to one of the world's biggest nations, it just freaked a lot of nations out. The likes of, China, Brazil. So now instead of a slow decline, everyone was actively kind of heading for the doors. And I just, yeah, such a big mistake. Such a big mistake. As I mentioned, China was one of the people that freaked out. China, while China obviously gets exploited by this petrodollar system. Some of their academics say that 2/3 of the profits of all of their industry, etc., end up going back to the US. So, this system, they're being exploited, but they still get that 1/3. and they were quite happy. They were developing very well through this system, so they were quite happy for this system to continue. And while they were doing some stuff to prepare themselves for the system to end, they in some ways were actively trying to keep this petrodollar system going. Um, but that all changed once they saw Russia's assets being confiscated. I think at that point they realized, look, if this can happen to Russia, it can happen to us. So we can't use this system to develop. We're just going to have to exit now. So that's when they actively, start running around and start unplugging everyone else from the system. Um, and that's where we are now. That's why everything is happening so crazy. I think there's a lot of desperation moves on the US side. EU is collapsing because they've been cannibalized. One YouTube video that I watched gave a really nice analogy where there's a black bear, and I believe it's actually ironically only found in the US. But the black bear goes out there every morning, and it goes and it eats whatever it can find. It goes around eating everyone else, all of the other animals and whatever else it eats. And that was kind of the US under this system, just going around exploiting everyone. But as this system fails and the black bear comes home, if the black bear comes home to its cubs and it's hungry itself, then it will cannibalize its own cubs. And I think that's quite a nice analogy, and that's what we've seen the US do. As the system has started to falter, they've come home, and now they're starting to cannibalize their own, which is EU, Japan, Korea. Interesting times. Not to end it on a depressing note, but one quote I got was from Antonio Gramsci from sometime before World War II, and he said, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." And that was as the old power and old reserve currency, which was Britain and the pound, was dying and trying. And the system was trying to make way for either the US or Germany or Russia to, probably less Russia, to replace Britain. But obviously Britain was fighting with everything they could, and we ended up with a lot of horrendous stuff happening. World War II being the culmination of that. And I think we're going through similar times, but I don't want to end it on a depressing note, because I actually think that this time will be a lot quicker, and as a result hopefully a lot easier. Like there won't be the same struggle, because we're already quite far along this process. The only issue is, of course, now the force multipliers that we have with stuff like nukes makes it scary. What happens when it really gets to that collapse moment. And that's it. I wanted this to be quick. Actually, it's a lot longer than I anticipated it being. It was a very quick kind of skip and jump over the different aspects. But hopefully you get an idea of the system that we live in, and now we can start in future videos digging a little bit deeper into this, giving some historic examples, but more importantly, go through some scenarios about what's going to happen and what all of this means for the future.